Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Solutions podcast. And I'm Nicola Peel, and I'm here with Derek Gow. So, welcome, Derek. So great to have you.
Hi, Nicola. Nice to speak to you as well.
Yay. So, in our little worlds, we're very much on a similar focus. So, how can we most benefit, the more than human species? What can we do for the wildlife that are so critically in our need at this time? And although I've just got a little 10-acre postage stamp, sometimes it seems, I have definitely noticed that my efforts in just allowing the wild edges to be wild and doing whatever I can here with a number of conservation groups, I've heard the difference. I mean, at the moment, the sound of the birds is just amazing. So it does make a difference. And so, hearing of your work, Derek, and what you've been doing has been a great inspiration for many. So, thank you very much on behalf of all the wild things. And so maybe you can give us a little introduction to, how did you get started? What was that passion that woke you up to the love of the natural world?
Okay, well, I guess in the very beginning, I'd always been interested in other creatures, and when I was quite little, a family friend gave me a Shetland sheep as a birthday present, and then not long after that, my mother bought a book by a guy called John Vince, which was talking about old breeds of British farm livestock. And this was at a time when all these things were incredibly rare. You didn't drive through the landscape and see herds of longhorn cattle or white bark cattle or Manx Lockton sheep or whatever else because they were all but done. They were many of these things were on the edge of extinction, and of course many of them had a long and deep cultural history and association with Britain. And I was involved with the Rabies Survival Trust, therefore, when I was a whole range of these animals at a place called Biggar in the Scottish borders. And I read all Gerald Durrell's books, and I read what I could about nature conservation elsewhere in the world. And I never really thought I would ever have the opportunity to become involved with anything. Anyway, when I left school, I worked in agriculture for 5 years, and then because of my interest in rare breeds, when I was made redundant, a colleague said, "Well, do you want to come and work for me? I run a country park on the outskirts of Scotland, on the outskirts of Glasgow, sorry, in Scotland, and um, and we have a collection of rare breeds there, and we'd like you to look after them." So I went to work there, and I was working again with cattle and sheep and pigs and all sorts of different things. And there was a small zoo in the country park, which was just a feted thing. I mean, it was tiny cages, old animals, the lame, the crippled, the blind, and the disabled. And anything less likely to have a nature conservation function, it was hard to really imagine. But about halfway through my term of employment, the guy who was running it at the time decided to leave. And my boss asked if I wanted to run the zoo. And you look at it and thought, I want nothing whatsoever to do with this. And he said, "Well, okay, we understand it's really bad, and we're going to be putting a lot more in the way. And if you agree to do it, we'll send you to Gerald Durrell Zoo on Jersey for a summer season, and then you can come back and you can direct what happens after that." So I did that, and it was great fun. I met people from all over the world, from Indonesia, from the Americas, from Africa, and India, and you meet the most incredible panoply of characters who are trying very hard, commonly under very difficult, and different circumstances, to conserve whatever their particular species was. And it became abundantly obvious that one, the risks they run are nothing compared to the risks we run in our insular, padded, safe little world. And two, that when you come back to Britain and you think all's organised, all safe, all secure, all's working well, that it really just isn't. We're a great nation for talking a big story, and for actually doing very little to support the case we've made. So I began working with native British species. I chaired the Dormouse, the Hazel Dormouse Captive Breeding and Reintroduction Group for a while for Natural England. And then I began to work on to other things like European beavers and water voles and wildcats and all sorts of other different creatures. So that's what I do here now, in part on the farms that we own, but also the land that I used to farm here, which is about 300 acres or more in one big block. And then we're buying other land downstream from us as and when we can. Um, we're now turning that all over to nature. So we're resowing the pastures here. We've just about finished that with yellow rattle and wildflower seeds. We've planted about 10,000 trees over winter. We're trying to get our stocking rates right, so that scrub starts to emerge back through the everything that had been formerly just dairy pasture for many decades. And the idea is that that we can't change the world here. What we can do without complicated debate is basically show people what can be done to start turning things round, and that's what we're doing here.
Totally. And I think that by showing, people learn much better by seeing. That's the best way that we learn. And I've felt exactly the same. It's like I haven't been able to get beavers. So we've built 15 leaky dams. We've learned from the beavers as good as we could. I'm sure if they looked at them, they wouldn't think much of them. But I can really see the difference with these 15 leaky dams. And so I want to bring people here to show them and say, hey, we can do the same. Yes, we absolutely can't wait for the beavers, but let's just get on with it ourselves as well. And so showing that way to other people that are, in a blessed state to actually be the guardians of land. So we have just had this very exciting news about, beavers can finally return to their homeland in England. And of course, that big exciting news. I sent a message to Isabella Tree, who lives just up the road from me here at NEP, saying, yay, great, good on you. Everybody, that's worked on helping, you being one of them. And Izzy's response was, yes, but we've really got to get it through to the landowners. Otherwise, it could backfire and they could be taken away again. So that kind of idea of, oh, hang on, we've really got a way to go. Yes, we've said about getting them released. How do we best communicate with the general public and the farmers about, we know the benefits of beavers, but how do we really kind of get that through to other people?
Well, I mean, there are two things. As he's right, and explaining to the landowners is one part of it. But the other part is, I take it you haven't read the small print yet when it comes to what you actually have to do. So what you actually have to do, in every other country that's reintroduced beavers, and the species have been restored throughout much of its Eurasian range, what happens is government makes a decision to do it, and then government does it. And what's happened in Britain is quite the opposite. Government has been forced into doing it because of the circumstances that surround the return of the species in Britain. And now government is handing the responsibility for actually doing it over to individuals and groups, which means that as opposed to it being a straightforward state funded project, you have to raise the funding and the ability to keep your project going for 10 years. You have to assume responsibility for all those animals do on a river system within that 10-year period, and you're accountable right the way through to Natural England under the terms of your license for this. So it's not going to be a straightforward process, and it's not going to be, I mean, while it might be something you can apply to small catchments, which are limited, the idea that it's jubilation time and they're going to be everywhere is simply not true. So it's going to be a long, hard slog before you get to the stage where this animal is restored more widely in Britain, and that's the
What do you
reality
think
of
was
it.
the original carrying capacity in the UK? How many do you think roughly there would
Oh,
have been? We got any
I mean, if you're
ideas?
looking at a wooded environment after the ice, you'd been looking at millions of animals, and there would have been millions of animals, occupying all the wet areas they possibly could, to the point where they dictated the landscapes completely before we took over that role to basically suit our own ends, and they would have regulated in large part the flows of rivers, the discharge of silts out into estuaries, woody debris going out to sea. They had a huge effect on landscapes, and we know this, of course, because when you look at parts of the world like North America, well, the beavers here were exterminated. I mean, though it's likely that small populations survived well into relatively modern historic times, and the last bounty records are from sites on the Humber, which take you, up to the beginning of the or they take you up to the 1790s, is that in North America, beavers were exterminated, were something we start killing really in the 1600s, and you can still see, you can trace the patterns of their loss in the estuaries where the sediments go out to sea. So you see a regulation of sediments and flows until you get to the times of the big killing. And once the big killing's done and the fur trappers have exterminated them from all catchments, then you really see what water unhindered by beaver activities can do. So there would have been a huge population of them, and they would have regulated landscapes.
Yeah, but it's amazing, isn't it, to really think that if we can, it wasn't that long ago, really, that they were an integral part of this landscape of this island that we live on. And I've been lucky to spend a lot of time working in the Amazon and seriously biodiverse places. And when I come back to the UK, it always feels like a bit of a green desert. And we go to our national parks, which we would think that national parks would be abundant of wildlife, but the UK is one of the most impoverished in the world. So England, what we've done to this island has just been an absolute tragedy. So this idea of bringing back what already belongs here. So that's the beavers, and I didn't know about the small print. So yes, it's definitely not celebration time, but it is a step in the right direction. But let's just hope the ones that are out there will go forth and multiply themselves. And so I mean, really, that's one of the greatest hopes, that the ones that are already out there are already establishing their own territories. And
Mm.
we've got that up here at NEP, with they've had kits 2 years running. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could just like open the fences and let them out? But of course, it's not going to be like that. They're going to be taking the ones from NEP to somewhere else to be released, which seems a shame that we can't just expand from the great work that they've done here. But also, the other exciting news is that my local village, Storrington, has become the first stork village in the UK. So that's another real success story up at NEP, is seeing the storks. And I had my first flyover of a stork, so that was great. But there, it's just, I was walking around NEP the other day, actually, and just there's so many of them now. I mean, they are happy. They've definitely found their place. They're happy there. They are going to be, moving across our landscape. And where I live, just up the road from Storrington, which, it was the River Store, the place was the original place of stores, says it in its name. And so we will be having the first Stork Festival this year. So that's something to start to celebrate. And I got very good news yesterday, thanks to the best thing to come out of our local district council is a partnership with the Sussex Wildlife Trust called Wilding Horsham District. And I've been working with them on a number of different conservation projects, including the leaky dams and laying hedges and eradicating Himalayan balsam and creating meadows. But now I've got a grant to put in a kingfisher box, which is a large box, because obviously kingfishers like to nest in the banks, and they're losing that habitat. The banks are flooding. So not only will we be getting a kingfisher box, but also a martin tower. So creating that habitat here. So yeah, we are all working together in those ways of who can support each other. And I love I know also that as part from you helping with the storks and the beavers, you also got a breeding program for glowworms. Last year I got 5 I found here on the farm. But how can we help the glowworms?
Well, glowworms are basically something that require coarse grassland and with scrub edge, with bramble touching it. And at one point in time, before everything was mowed and flailed, they were common wee beetles. I mean, they were found right the way through the wider environment. They were found in fields, and of course, because we now graze fields, very intensively, or we plough, or the technology we have allows us to take arable right up to the edge, then basically it means there's just no space for wee things like this anymore. So we don't exactly know what they're doing as a species in Britain, but what we do know is that they're becoming increasingly isolated. And the people you speak to will tell you they can remember them very clearly, but that was always typically, 10, 15 years ago. And as soon as you start cutting the hedges, you need rough grassland, which, can recreate itself, reestablish itself. But of course, the problem with glowworms is that though they are mobile to probably a much greater extent than we appreciate, is that it's the males that fly and the females don't. And the females are the ones that basically produce the glow that draws the males in. And once you mow them for a couple of years, then you kill the first instars coming out the following year, and then the next year you kill the other ones, and that's it. So recolonization thereafter is a very, very difficult thing for them to do. So at the moment, we're looking to breed probably somewhere in the region of about 1,000 larvae plus this year, and then they'll go on to a variety of different sites for reintroduction projects. And that's what we're doing for glowworms. But we intend to start working with a bunch of other insects shortly. We have a breeding population of mole crickets here, which is a large subterranean cricket that, as far as anybody knows, there's maybe perhaps one small population in the New Forest of a handful of individuals. But this once common and once widespread species, which is a wetland cricket, it lives in wetlands feeding on vegetation and invertebrates under the soil. Which was once found from the Channel coast to Assynt and Sutherland to the west coast of England to the east coast. It's all gone. So we're looking at working with a bunch of other insects as well. And the glowworm's just one.
Well, crickets is another one of my success stories because, I was only saying a few years ago that why don't we have the sound of crickets anymore? And then once I started to do this meadow management, 2 years ago, I went up there and it was like, wow, what's that sound? And it was this shocking, the fact that they had disappeared from this landscape. But by doing nothing apart from creating the habitat, they just appear. And, into a quantity that, it was really, really audible. And that's what amazes me. We create the habitat and they come from goodness knows where. But that's one of the magics of doing any kind of, rewilding and restoration of. It's really about the habitat. And I was really devastated recently when a local farmer put up these really bright lights. And, there's just people just don't understand how detrimental that is to the glowworm, to the bats, to everything else. And but it's very hard to talk to people. They just see the security issues and can't really understand how much light impacts as well. So there's
it's difficult.
So we've got to be able to talk about wolves. I mean, that's got to be the vision, isn't it? The lynxes and the wolves, and getting some kind of key predators back into this habitat. And I read your book, The Shadow Wolf, which was great and absolutely shocking. I don't know what the word is, really just horrified at what we had done, how we had vilified them, and that kind of stories that people believe that still the wolves are going to eat their babies and there is definitely fear because, I have definitely since reading the book been speaking more about wolves and people are afraid of them. So it feels like there's a real lack of education around, the benefits of having wolves back in our landscape and, how we can start to have that conversation. And I did go down to Ben Goldsmith's last year, and it was great to see a little wildcat. And, this wasn't a lynx, this was just a small wildcat. But also when I looked at it, that wasn't no pussycat. It had a very different vibe to a domestic cat. So there's the whole wildness in these creatures. And so you've got lynx there. So I'm just interested to know a bit more about the character differences with them, with the lynx, with the wolf, when we compare them to what we're used to, domestic cats and domestic pet dogs. and this, remembering the wild of lynx and wolves. And so you've worked closely with them. And what would you say about their personality differences?
Well, I mean, things like the lynx we have here, of course, are captive animals, so they're very well used to people and very bold. They're very different character-wise to wild lynx. Wild lynx are timid, shy, recalcitrant, reclusive, and the chances. I mean, I've been to Białowieża and been lucky enough to go to a number of other parts of Europe where lynx live wild. And if you speak to the people who live alongside them, they'll tell you they never see them. That I remember going out to the primeval forest one time with a guide who was I think he was a priest perhaps in one of the local villages, and he did wildlife guiding spare time. And he said he'd lived his whole life in that forest and he'd seen a lynx twice. So you don't see them, whereas these cats here are bold and unafraid of you. So quite untypical of what lynx would be like. Wild cats, they're old, name. They were called a variety of different things, and in the olden days. I mean, one of the common names was the woodcat, and that's what they are. I mean, they're this little, mouse killing animal of deciduous woodlands that again would have been everywhere. But we hunt. The story's always the same. We're either hunting and killing them for something we want, or we're hunting and killing them to protect something we want, or we're killing them now just as an aside with our pesticides and our means of land, our modern, more efficient means of land management. So, and what finished off the wildcat was that it was, in large part, a very successful predator of rabbits. And rabbits in the Middle Age, rabbits don't really start to be something that runs free in Britain until you get beyond the Industrial Revolution. And when you get to the Industrial Revolution and people buy big houses and parklands and decide that they want to play at being squires and wandering around shooting things, and they employ a bunch of people called gamekeepers. The gamekeepers, as we know of old, were the people who killed everything and who still in part do in some areas of England and Scotland that looked as if it was going to have any interest in games. So if it could kill a partridge or a rabbit or whatever else, they killed it. And so efficient were this guild of people that by the time you get to the early years of the 20th century, the wildcats are finishing on Exmoor and perhaps the last die as the First World War rolls in. And in Scotland, they're confined to the far northwest, which is a landscape of cliff top and scree and sea cliff, and it's really quite a formidable existence for an animal that's a woodland animal. And then gradually recover, but they hybridize the domestic cats because the landscape again is so hard used and there's so much hostility to them, and still do. So that by the time you finish, or by the time you get to now, what you've got up in Scotland living free is this bodge of domestic cats and wildcat hybrids that is just slipping away from what the species was, with people still killing them and with the landscape still being very poor in terms of prey and cover for them. So what we're looking at doing, and we intend to move on with shortly, is releasing wildcats in England, where we can, back into the deciduous forests that were once their home, where in some parts people now have no longer any interest in killing these little animals at all, and where they generally be accepted. And we've been working with Devon Wildlife Trust to try and create a viable project. And they've just finished the social science element of that, and had a significant response from people with regard to the idea of wildcat reintroduction. I think something like 99.9% of people all thought it was a great idea. So now it's a case of ticking all the boxes and crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's and trying to find the cash and getting on with it. So,
So,
but
so
that's
99% approval for wildcats, but what would you say would be the percentage if we asked the same about reintroduction of wolves?
well, people have asked that question. There have been a couple of surveys that have looked at the potential to return creatures like this, and the answer has been, people support the idea of more nature. Now, the wolf is an interesting one because what you find when you start to look at its return in Western Europe is that you start with very high approval ratings when there aren't very many of them, and the longer you live with them, the more concerned people become about wolves. But in large part, that concern comes from the nonsensical, inflammatory um, 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 information that's provided. It's not really information, but it's disinformation that's provided by the agricultural lobby. Because what you get is you get people like Commissioner for Agriculture, who knows full well that sheep farming in Europe is an economic insignificance, and yet will stand at a podium in Brussels and bang on about the wolves being a huge problem for his industry, when in reality the huge problem for his industry is a continuation of public funding for them to continue to live the lives they want to live while still using the pesticides they use just to destroy the soil, so that the day will come when you can't use them to produce anything. So that's the big problem. And the wolf's just a wee kind of figurehead that you can slap every now and again. And of course, that's exactly why I've persuaded that there was a good case for their extermination in Britain, and then as evangelists we took that case for the extermination without even understanding it to every new world as colonists we went to. So it's once you persuade people that the black is white, if those people are stupid, then that black is white stays within their mind for generations and centuries, and it's very, very difficult to change those attitudes. And we know that wolves are not a big issue for domestic livestock where abundant wild prey remains, but of course we want the wild prey. They're our boar, our deer, everything is ours, and wolves killing what they kill, well, that's just no longer any good. And then when you take the wild prey away, then of course they start on domestic livestock, and domestic livestock's ours as well. So what you do is you hedge a creature into a landscape where it can have no existence, and that's us. We're kind of like we're almost rodent-like in the fact that we always gnaw around the edges of everything, even if we know it should be left, even if we know it should be sacrosanct, like the Arctic. In the end, we're always there. We always want the resources, and sooner or later, we take it. That's what we do. So all you can do as individuals is wake up in the morning and decide on the day when your eyes open whether you're going to be that kind of person or whether you're going to be the other kind of person. And what you need is more of the former and less of the latter. It's a huge cultural and attitude change that we have to make with regard to nature conservation the world over, if indeed we're ever going to get to the place where we can exist in this imaginary Garden of Eden at peace and alongside the other creatures we'd like to share the earth with.
Yeah, and that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about coexisting, that remembering that we can exist. Humans are not sitting on the top of the pyramid, and being able to shift that to that way where actually it's remembering that we are already living in this Garden of Eden. It isn't somewhere else. It's here on Earth. It's this absolute, paradise. But sadly, most people can't actually even see that. So there's so much control in the way that humans are, that until we can actually really see the beauty in what's already around us and want to be able to allow it to flourish, move past this other stupid idea of being sustainability as the goal, and instead moving towards something which is more thriving and flourishing, and really having that vision for the world, and becoming better land managers. And we see that now with the deer, that people are happy to eat beef, but they don't want to eat wild deer. And so the landscape gets decimated by the deer because there's no wolves, because there's no predators, but humans are also not being that predator that they could be if they were working with the natural world. So it's finding that way, isn't it, for us to learn to be better guardians, as well as just stepping back a little bit and allowing those wild edges. And I was actually asked last week at a big private school in the southeast. We did a whole day's environmental awareness for the school, and one of the challenges, they asked me to walk around the grounds with the students and for them to come up with a plan of how they could bring more wildlife into this school. This is a big private school, a lot of grounds. Most of it was astroturf. And there was nothing. They said the only birds that they ever see are crows and seagulls. There's nothing else there. And you think, God, with all that land and astroturf. So it was kind of easy to make some suggestions. And but of course, the suggestions had to come from the children. And the headmaster had asked if we could, write up on a page suggestions for the children after the day of what they would like to see bringing more wildlife into the school. And and it was great hearing some of the kids say, "Rip up the astroturf." But it was just making it really obvious that when we had a look and we all look down in this area and look, and there's nothing. But it's a bit like that when you look down over England and we see these nice fields, and thank goodness to the hedges, because they are our only wildlife corridors really. But I think people do need to remember that this landscape is so impoverished, and we urgently need all hands on deck, people getting involved with their local conservation groups. And there's many little groups out there, and the great work of the wildlife trusts, and they're just waiting for more people to show up and help them financially, but also helping them with their own hands and their own bodies to get stuck in and do the work. So thank you so much, Derek, for this time to just share a bit about what you're doing. And any last message for the listeners? What anything out there?
Be a good person if you can.
Be a good person if you can. That's all we want, really, isn't it? So yes, be a good person if you can. I second that. Thank you so much. And I'll put the
No
links
problem.
to Eric's farm and the work that you're doing there after this video. So thank you so much.
No problem. Lovely speaking to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.